Lindsay Chervinsky is the brand new executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon. Simultaneously, her brand new book on John Adams has just been published. The book's title, Making the Presidency. In her introduction, Dr. Chervinsky writes that Adams was guaranteed to fall short in comparison to George Washington. She says the challenge of the second president therefore called for someone to battle the growing partisan divisions without Washington's presence. Adams served only one term and was defeated by Thomas Jefferson for a second.
Do you know any social studies, media, or literature teachers in grades 6 through 12? Encourage them to participate in C-SPAN's Student Cam video documentary competition. With the upcoming November election, we're asking young people to address the theme, Your Message to the President. What issue is most important to you or your community? $100,000 in cash prizes will be awarded to students and teachers. To learn more, go to studentcam.org.
Lindsay Chervinsky, since we last talked last year, you've got a new job, and I want to hear why you took the librarian's job at Mount Vernon.
Well, thank you. So I should start by saying I'm the executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library. I am very cautious to say I'm not a librarian because they have a whole set of expertise that I do not. But I have wonderful librarians on my staff. I took the job because it was a really great opportunity to lead the library into its second career or its second decade in existence. And it felt to me like a really important time, both for the nation with all of these historic anniversaries coming up, but also history has become contentious and has become a subject of our political culture. And so it's more important now than ever that hopefully it can be shared well.
Well, let's start on your book on John Adams. How did John Adams get along throughout his career with George Washington?
It was a little bit up and down. So initially, when they first came to the Continental Congress together, I think they had a great deal of respect and they were very much aligned on the importance of independence. And so they respected each other's contributions towards that final goal. And John Adams was instrumental in arranging for Washington to be nominated as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. But then the relationship soured a little bit because Adams had been critical of some of Washington's choices as commander-in-chief at low points during the war, and Washington wasn't very good at forgetting criticism or forgiving public criticism. But nonetheless, I think that they sort of, worked through it and continued to have respect for one another. And Washington understood the importance of foreign policy and diplomacy and the treaties that Adams had been integral in signing. And so when they first were brought together in the new federal government with Washington as president and John Adams as vice president, Washington did ask Adams for advice, and I think that maybe he envisioned a closer working relationship until John Adams made some suggestions for a title for the president that was quite ostentatious and not what Washington had in mind, and that was a very unpopular decision. And I think that caused Washington to distrust his political judgment and really separated himself and kept Adams at arm's length. So they were cordial, they socialized in the same circles multiple times a week, but they were not close governing partners.
Why did John Adams get picked to run in the first place?
Well, when the elections took place in when the elections took place, the first several elections, the way the election system worked was basically the electors cast ballots and the top two vote getters became the president and vice president. And pretty much everyone knew that Washington was going to become the first president. There was no question. There was really no competition. And indeed, he's the only president who's been elected unanimously twice. And so I think there was a consensus that there needed to be some geographic representation to bring different parts of the country into the new republic and to this new government and to make them feel invested. And so there were lots of different Northerners that were considered, but he definitely had the most experience of all of them. And at that point, voters were really concerned about that. They were concerned about making sure they brought in people who had demonstrated a lifelong loyalty to this project. And so then he served for 8 years as George Washington's vice president. And there was this consensus among most of the Federalists that he was kind of the heir apparent. He was the person that was closest, both sort of physically to Washington in terms of his proximity, but also constitutionally. And he made sense as a natural person for them to select as their nominee. And he won that election by 3 electoral votes.
Tell us the difference between being a Federalist and a Republican back then, and who were in each camp.
So the Federalists generally had their base of support in New England, coastal areas, some elite Southerners, but generally along the coast and in the North, definitely more in cities. They tended to prefer a strong federal government, a strong army and navy. They recognized the value and wanted to lean into trade with Great Britain. Were a little bit suspicious of the French Republic, especially as it devolved into violence and anarchy during the French Revolution, and had sort of a sense of a little bit of like a meritocracy. Like they believed in the importance of best men leading the nation. And so Alexander Hamilton is most synonymous with the Federalists. Although Washington and Adams were nominally Federalist, they were not as partisan as others. Some of his closest allies were Timothy Pickering, who was the Secretary of State, Theodore Sedgwick, who was a senator and then the Speaker of the House, Oliver Wolcott Jr., who was the Secretary of the Treasury, and so on. The Jeffersonian Republicans, or as they called themselves, the Republicans, tended to get more of their support from immigrants, working class, people in the West and in the South. They distrusted big government. They distrusted the army. They knew that trade was required, but they wanted there to be less focus on it, less government investment, as we might say. They thought the ideal American was a farmer, like a yeoman farmer, which meant someone who had a big enough farm to take care of your family in an independent style. And they typically were led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and James Monroe, as well as some Northerners like Aaron Burr and George Clinton.
Describe John Adams.
John Adams was brilliant, stubborn, sometimes difficult, very funny, self-deprecating, very aware of his own flaws, aware that the best decision he ever made was his wife, Abigail, deeply patriotic and loyal to the nation, very wise when it came to foreign policy and understanding how the world worked and what the United States needed to do to survive in that international community, and often an anathema to his contemporaries. But for all the things that made him confusing to them, those are the things that I think we would actually like the best: his openness, his honesty, his funniness. I think he was a very lovable curmudgeon.
Describe Thomas Jefferson, who is his opponent.
Thomas Jefferson was sort of the ideal Southern aristocratic gentleman. He was very worldly in his interests and his views. He was fluent in French. He loved almost all things French. He loved French food, French wine. He was extremely well read, very much a man of the Enlightenment, had a lot of different interests, including science and inventions and technology and gardening. He was born into a very wealthy family, unlike John Adams, who really had to work hard his entire life to support his wife and his children. He was much more reserved. He didn't really like big groups, but he could be very charming in small spaces. He was a brilliant writer. I find him sometimes difficult to wrap my mind around. And for all of his genius, he was of course, the main author in the Declaration of Independence and probably one of the most pivotal figures from 1775 to 1825. His vice presidency is perhaps when he behaves the worst and comes remarkably close to treason.
The way you defined John Adams and being popular in the North, Northeast, and Thomas Jefferson being popular in the South leads me to want to ask you, are we still divided in the country in the same way?
Well, I think that we certainly have divisions. We're not necessarily as divided geographically as I think that we were. There are, of course, red parts and there are blue parts, but our divisions are, I think, sometimes more complex. There's a rural-urban divide, which was actually true back then as well. There's sort of a coast-interior divide, which was also true. I think their divisions in the 1790s were multifaceted, which is very similar to how we are operating in this moment. Whereas, for example, in the 1850s, the divide was very clearly over one issue. And so I think that the 1790s offer a remarkable parallel for our current moment and a lot of really interesting lessons about how we should understand our politics and how to sometimes get out of it.
In your book, both in the beginning on page 8 and in the last page of your book, you mention the following. I'll just read the sentence. These norms and customs largely held firm until January the 6th, 2021, when Americans were reminded of the preciousness and fragility of republics. Why mention that twice?
Well, I think that it was a turning point for American history. It was the first time there had ever been a violent transition. The Civil War was an anomaly in that the South saw the results of the election, accepted the results, and then wanted to leave the nation, which was a very different scenario. So I think it's worth pointing out the unprecedented nature. But more importantly, it is the answer to why this book, because most people have at least heard of, if not read, the book on John Adams by David McCullough, or maybe some of the other great biographies by people like Joe Ellis or John Ferling or, Page Smith. There are a lot of them. And what I realized after January 6th is that none of those authors had lived through a violent transition. And seeing the fragility and realizing how much I had taken that for granted caused me to ask different questions about John Adams' presidency. It caused me to say, what did he do to try and create this practice, to ensure that the very beginnings of this all-important precedent would exist? And history depends on the questions we ask. And so those were the questions I was asking. And I think it's my way of saying there's nothing wrong with these biographies. They just were written before this thing happened. And so we have a very different perspective.
The David McCullough book sold over 1 million copies. HBO
Those are some good life goals.
HBO did a series of 7 parts about John Adams from the David McCullough book. What were you thinking when you said, I'm going to come up against that fact? And what would we see different in your book than in the David McCullough book?
Well, maybe I had to be a little bit insane. I did tell my publishers when we were working on the cover that I had 2 rules. One, it could not be yellow, and it could not have the same portrait as David McCullough's book, because I did understand what was coming. I was really inspired by McCullough's book. I read it when it first came out. I was younger. I found it to be so captivating, and I love the way that he writes. I love the way that he brings people alive. I think that people will perhaps find a much more politically savvy John Adams than they expect, especially as president. He was much more conniving in a good way when it came to politics that he's not often given credit for. He was funny. I think he had a real sense of humor. And I think actually David really embraced that. I think as brilliant as Paul Giamatti was in his depiction in the HBO miniseries, he sometimes does make Adams a little bit, he's like dark kind of all the time. And certainly John Adams had dark moments, but he also had real joy and joie de vivre and humor. And there were things that he loved and had passion for. So I hope that they will find that. And I also hope that they will see that all of these biographies, they give relatively few pages to Adams' presidency. And I get that, because when you're writing about a life as long and as full as John Adams, you have to make choices. But the presidency deserves more than, I think, just a chapter. I think it's really an important contribution. And as we've refocused our attention on the presidency and how central it is to American life, hopefully people will see the contribution Adams made to make it a really important part of our republic.
What were his contributions to the presidency?
So I would say there are 3 big ones. First, he showed up. Anyone who came after Washington was going to have a terrible time. It was going to be awful because there was only one other model for them to follow. They were going to be compared to Washington, and he had such unusual stature and respect that everyone was going to fall short. And Adams knew it, and he showed up anyway. And that, I think, took remarkable, you could say political obstinacy or political courage to do it, but he proved that other people could be in that office and that it in fact would work and survive once Washington was gone. The second thing is he was very protective of executive power, not necessarily his own authority, but executive power more broadly. And he asserted the president's right to craft and shape foreign policy. He was the first president to fire a cabinet secretary, which was a power that was very theoretical and sort of nebulous until he actually did it and defended it. And this was at a time when the cabinet was really trying to create almost like a power sharing agreement, like the British cabinet we see today. And he pushed back on those efforts, which totally changed the character of the executive branch. And then the third one is the peaceful transfer of power. We have seen in our own experience that it takes both people to be very committed to this concept. And Adams is the common denominator in the first two and was very intentional and careful about how he went about crafting those things that I think serve as really the central part of what it means to have a democracy.
As you know, Donald Trump didn't show up at the inauguration, and neither did John Adams. You point out in the book that he left town at 4 o'clock in the morning. What significance is that?
So I think with John Adams' departure, there's a couple things we have to keep in mind. The first is that the precedent of a defeated president attending an inauguration was not established until 1845. And there was no precedent of that at the state level either. So governors didn't typically attend. Adams also didn't know if Jefferson wanted him there. Jefferson didn't invite him, didn't say anything about it. And the election had come so close to violence, so close to completely falling apart once it was tied and it was thrown to the House of Representatives, that Adams didn't want to do anything that would distract from the transition, would take away from the celebration, would restrict Jefferson's ability to turn the page. So there's no doubt that he was bitter that he lost. There's no doubt that he was deeply mourning the loss of his son Charles to alcoholism and that he just wanted to go home. But I also think it is accurate to say that he had some higher motives, which is that he didn't want to do anything that would jeopardize this very important moment. Unlike other moments over history where it's been very clear that this expectation that both the former and the new president will attend and have sort of the ceremonial handing over of authority.
Because you named your dog after John Quincy Adams, let me ask you about his children.
Okay.
What were they like, and what was his relationship to them?
Well, his children were, there was an Adams family tradition for several generations that there was one child who seemed to really excel and do wonderful and do incredible things, often on behalf of the nation, and was very committed to public service, and the other children often really struggled. So Adams had one surviving daughter that lived to adulthood. She had a very poor marriage. Her husband was very flagrant in his spending and was often off in the West up to some sort of speculation. And so she actually lived with her parents off and on quite regularly. He had his son Charles, who died of alcoholism while he was president. His other son, Thomas, had served as the secretary to John Quincy when John Quincy was a diplomat. And Thomas was apparently quite lovely and just a really warm and engaging person. But he wrote this incredibly heartbreaking letter that said at one point, "I know I will never be my brother, and I know I will never live up to my brother." And I think those demons weighed on him, and so he died young as well. And then John Quincy Adams is an extraordinary human in American history. He started serving as his father's secretary when he was 12. He spoke like 7 languages at least. He served as minister to all these incredible places, and then as Secretary of State, and as a senator, and then as president, and then went back after his presidency and served a lengthy term in Congress and was a stalwart opponent of slavery and the gag rule. Adams' relationship with his children was complicated. He was gone for many of their childhood. He didn't see them sometimes for several years at a time. He was definitely closest to John Quincy, and then I think his daughter as well, Nabby. He had a very warm relationship with John Quincy, and they had incredible respect for one another. Perhaps one of the best letters John Adams wrote occurred at the very end of his life when he lived to see John Quincy become president, and he wrote him a note that said, "I have no words." And John Adams almost never had no words. So he had a very lovely, although sometimes complex, relationship with them.
When we talked in episode 131 of this podcast, you said that you might someday write a book about John Quincy Adams. Are you any closer?
I'm thinking about it. I am toying around with a couple of ideas about the next project, and that is certainly one of them. I think that he's such a compelling character, and it certainly makes it easier that all of his diaries are now digitized and transcribed and online. So as one is doing research, that is an incredible asset. One of the things I'm trying to grapple with is with this new job we've discussed, my schedule looks a little different. And so I have no doubt that I will write a book. I just kind of got to figure out how to fit it in to my new day-to-day existence.
For someone who's not been there to the library, it's beautiful, it's big, it's relatively new. What's your day like?
Well, no day is really the same as the one before, which is one of the reasons I like it, because I'm never bored. I am often meeting with staff to figure out what sort of projects they're working on, what they need assistance with. So whether that's acquiring new treasures for the library, whether it's updating a management system in terms of what's happening online, whether it's working on one of our podcasts or programs. We have a lot of public programs, or our Leadership Institute. We have a Leadership Institute that provides programming for people in the government and organizations and companies to come and learn from history and then discuss how they can apply it to their contemporary life. I'm regularly meeting with my other counterparts that work on the other parts of the estate. So learning about like what's happening in curation and preservation. And that's a huge subject right now because we're undergoing this huge preservation project for the mansion to ensure that it survives for another 200 years. We often work together on, big goals, and so meeting with them. But then I'm also doing media and doing conversations like this one. I am trying to be an ambassador for the library and for the estate more broadly to bring it to more of the American public. And I'm trying to continue to hone my expertise as a presidential historian. So trying to continue to do the scholarship and the research so that I don't get rusty.
Can the average person visit the library?
We do have open houses. Typically on President's Day is a great time to come visit, and most people can make an appointment. They might have some questions about what you want to work on, but we are by appointment. So if people want to come and visit and there's something they need to research, you can reach out to the library and make an appointment to do so.
One of the things in reading your book that got my interest, and I wanted to ask you about it, is the letter. This is in 1800, October the 24th, 1800. Letter published by Alexander Hamilton, who has leaked this out to one of the publications, concerning the public conduct and character of John Adams. And one of the things he says in the letter is that John Adams is disgusting ego. What was this letter, and why was it so, critical of John Adams?
Well, Alexander Hamilton's main objection to John Adams was that he couldn't control him. And he said he was too independent, not enough of a party man, which to us actually sounds pretty good. We generally want our presidents to have independent sort of knowledge and independent sort of thinking as they are approaching big issues. But really what Hamilton meant is that he couldn't control him, and that really annoyed him. And at various points in the administration, Adams stymied certain projects that Hamilton was working on, most importantly being the expansion of the U.S. Army, which sounds to us like that gives us pause. We generally want the president to be supportive of the Army, but at this point, Hamilton really wanted to use the Army against his domestic enemies and for very political purposes, which is obviously not something we would be comfortable with, nor was Adams. So Adams stymied that project. He stymied his attempt to control foreign policy. And then over the summer of 1800, leading up to this letter, Adams ignored Hamilton. And there was nothing more that Hamilton hated than being ignored. And so he had sent a number of letters to Adams asking for an explanation for certain criticism that Adams had made of the extreme wing of the Federalist Party, and Adams ignored them. And so Hamilton published this diatribe, which has an awful lot of projection in it. And most of his friends and his allies warned him not to publish it for exactly that reason. They said, you're going to accuse him of having an ego, it's going to make it look like you have an ego. You're going to accuse him of being rash, it's going to make you look rash. And indeed, they were right. When the pamphlet came out, it really backfired, and it made Hamilton look like he could not be trusted and that he was unreliable. But it was based on, I think, many years of disagreements between the two of them and Hamilton's deep insecurity that everything that he wanted was slipping away from him. I think it cannot be separated from the fact that George Washington had died 10 months earlier, and Hamilton understood that with Washington gone, his own prospects had taken a pretty significant hit.
He also accused him of having distempered jealousy. That makes any sense? John Adams was jealous?
Well, so the jealousy comes in a couple of ways. So people accused Adams of being jealous of Washington and therefore also being jealous of the cabinet secretaries, the popularity of the other Federalists. And there was no doubt that sometimes Adams really resented that his public service, which was just as lengthy and sometimes just as grueling as George Washington's, was not celebrated in the same way. It really bothered him that diplomatic service didn't receive the same applause as military service. And so certainly they were talking about that. But also, once Adams was president, Washington's birthday continued to be celebrated. And Adams kind of took objection to that because he said that's a very monarchical thing to do. In the United States, it's one thing to celebrate, the president's birthday, but that would be about the office, not about the person in it. And so he kind of had objections to these ongoing ceremonies. And that was really what sort of started these accusations of jealousy, that Adams was jealous of Washington and was taking it out on Washington's allies and supporters, namely Alexander Hamilton.
Why did John Adams never attend a cabinet meeting? I know you wrote a book on the cabinet of George Washington's when he was vice president.
He was never invited. Washington never included him in those deliberations. Now, I don't necessarily blame Washington for doing so because it's not really clear what the vice president is supposed to do at this point. And till this day, there's only a couple of mentions of the vice president in the Constitution, and the main responsibility is just to have a pulse. So Adams, not really knowing what to do, sat in on the Senate every day and as the president of the Senate, and did cast a number of tie-breaking votes. So I can understand on one hand why maybe Washington thought of the vice president as perhaps a member more of the legislative branch and keep himself separate. But I don't actually think it was that. I think it was more that he just didn't really trust him. And I don't necessarily blame him for that because I do think the cabinet has to be whatever is going to help the president be the best president they can be and give the best advice. What I do blame Washington for not doing is he did not share information with Adams that he should have shared about the cabinet, and in particular about the quality of a couple of the secretaries, namely Secretary of War James McHenry and Secretary of State Timothy Pickering.
There was a time where John Adams spent 8 months away from the presidency in his hometown of Quincy, Massachusetts. Why and what impact did that have on his image?
Most of the years that Adams was president, he did go home for a lengthy summer visit, but it was not this long. It was maybe a couple of months. And the time that he was away up until that point was consistent with the amount of time that Washington had been away. The difference was that Washington made several short visits because Mount Vernon is so much closer to Philadelphia, whereas John Adams had to travel much farther up to Boston, and so he went for one lengthy visit. In 1799, he was home for 8 months, and I think there are a couple of reasons. The first and perhaps most important is that Abigail, his wife, was extremely sick that summer and that fall, and he did not want to leave her because he wasn't sure if she was going to survive. However, once it was clear she was going to survive, he did not go back, and I think mostly the reason he didn't go back is because at this point he had really split with his cabinet over the army, over diplomacy. It was very uncomfortable, very tense environment, and he didn't want anything to do with them. I think he was just trying to put distance between himself and this very cantankerous cabinet. He also did use that distance as one of the tools to undermine the army because he made Secretary McHenry send him so many things for approval that he slowed the process of building out the army. In terms of the outcome, in terms of what happened, I think that it slowed his ultimate decision to send a new peace commission to France, which they did end up sailing in November of 1799, but he definitely slowed that process. And had they gotten there sooner, it's possible that the ultimate outcome, the Treaty of Mortefontaine, would have gotten back to the United States sooner and could have had an impact on his re-election chances in 1800. There was also a building sense, kind of an unease of him not being around, especially as important things happened, like the Freeze Rebellion, which rebellion is quite generous. It was not a rebellion. It was a little bit of a protest, but nonetheless, they called it a rebellion at the time. So there was a sense that he was abandoning his duties. And I think that it exacerbated the splits in the Federalist Party.
How long would it take to go from Washington, D.C. or Philadelphia in the early part of his presidency to Boston?
It usually took him about 2 weeks. Usually they would go up to New York City. They stopped in New York City for a couple of days to see family and then traveled north to Boston. But the problem was that oftentimes you have no control over the weather. So if it's incredibly hot, you're riding in a carriage that has no air conditioning, and they would regularly stop, sometimes every hour, to give the horses a break and to take off their heavy clothes so that they could cool down before getting back on the road. There were no regular hotels like we have today. So at one particular journey, they were riding back up to Boston, and there was nowhere for them to sleep. And so this hostel or this tavern basically put a mattress on the floor for the president and the first lady. So it was a very different sort of accommodations. No Air Force One, no very fancy hotels. That was not how it worked in 1799.
How long, and he did it several times, would it take him to go across the Atlantic during the times that he was a minister in Europe?
It really depended on the weather and the type of year. If you were very, very lucky, if all the stars aligned and the weather was perfect and everything went great, you could make it from Philadelphia to the west coast of Spain in 3 weeks. This is on a very small wooden ship, so those 3 weeks would not have been very fun. But that was much better than the worst case scenario, which was that it could take up to 2 months if you had really, really horrible weather, which on one occasion, Elbridge Gerry, who was one of the envoys that John Adams sent, did experience. And it could be just an absolutely miserable existence.
Back to Alexander Hamilton's 54-page letter. This quote from there: "The ungovernable indiscretion of Mr. Adams' temper." Did he have a temper?
He did have a temper. He was very aware he had a temper. He was very aware that he could be rash. Whenever he was given the possibility, he tried to govern that. And so what he would do is, let's say he got a letter that he was reading and it made him really mad, he would write a response, set it aside, then write a more temperate response, set that aside, and then write a third draft, which was usually the one he would send publicly. When he got into trouble was when he was talking with someone in person and they made him really mad, and he wasn't always able to control his temper then. So Hamilton generally brought out the worst in Adams, and at one point Hamilton confronted Adams and tried to tell him what to do about foreign policy, and Adams was aghast because Hamilton had never been to England, had never been to France, had never served in a diplomatic position, and yet had the audacity to lecture the president who had done all of those things. And Adams completely lost it on him and told him he was a fool and he knew nothing, and he couldn't imagine anyone being more poorly informed.
So what impact did it have on the relationship and others that you talk about that say John Adams never fought in the war, but went to Europe for lots of years? Alexander Hamilton fought in the war, and there was a great deal of difference between Alexander Hamilton was at the Constitutional Convention, Adams was not. What kind of tension was there because of things like this among these founders?
Well, I think the biggest tension really came from the fracturing in the Federalist Party. And I placed that fracturing in 1798. It was starting to emerge in that Adams was always a little bit more moderate. There was a wing of the party that was a little bit more moderate. There was a wing that was a little bit more extreme. And the more extreme wing was led by Alexander Hamilton and Timothy Pickering and Theodore Sedgwick, some of those folks. And what happened in 1798 was that as war with France appeared likely, Congress expanded the U.S. Army, and Adams asked Washington to come back to be the commander. But he was going to stay at Mount Vernon until France actually invaded, and so whoever was number two was going to have all of the effective governing power. And Adams wanted anyone but Hamilton. And his cabinet, or at least members of his cabinet, insisted that it be Hamilton, and basically boxed Adams into a corner with Washington's assistance, or forced Washington, or kind of convinced Washington to box Adams into this corner such that he didn't have a choice. And at that point, that was the break in the party, where Adams no longer trusted his cabinet. He no longer trusted this faction. He saw that they had very different goals and aims, and he felt that they were inappropriate and partisan and self-serving and really not in the best interest of the nation or in the best interest of his presidency. Over the next year, those divisions were exacerbated because of his decision to pursue diplomacy, which the more extreme wing of the party was really against. And I think that in those circumstances, the more extreme wing kind of lined up behind Hamilton in the military tradition, but it wasn't really necessarily even about the military, although they absolutely did use Adams' lack of military experience against him. They said he didn't know what he was talking about, and how could he possibly choose officers, and how could he possibly manage a potential war. I think it was more of just this very different vision for the nation, and they fractured over that.
What do you think of this sentence from the letter? Mr. Adams has repeatedly indulged in virulent and indecent abuse of me.
Yeah, I mean, Hamilton had done the same thing, sometimes worse. So this is this sentence gets at the criticism. In the summer of 1800. Adams started talking about how there was a quote unquote British faction in the Federalist Party. And what he meant was there was a faction that wanted war with France at all costs, wanted a close alliance with the British, was maybe a little bit too interested in having like a military dictatorship. And this was at a time when the Revolutionary War had really ended just less than 15 years before. Most of the Americans that had lived through the Revolution were still in existence at this time. They still had very strong memories. And so to call someone a British faction was quite shocking and quite scandalous. And it was an insult. And this was what Hamilton had demanded an explanation for. And Adams refused to respond to the letter. And you couldn't exactly challenge the president to a duel, which would have been Hamilton's usual course of action. So instead, he published the pamphlet.
Last sentence from the letter. It will not appear an exaggeration to those who have studied his character to suppose that he is capable of being alienated from a system to which he has been attached because it is upheld by men whom he hates.
So this is Hamilton saying he's not a good Federalist, that he is willing to break from the Federalist Party. He is willing to step away from the traditional Federalist line because he doesn't like a lot of the Federalists. The problem was the Federalist line was often really bad and really damaging, and would have been really terrible for the country if Adams had blindly followed those policies and those principles. So Hamilton was right that Adams was willing to break with them, and he did distrust a lot of the extreme Federalists. But in retrospect, I think that demonstrates incredible judgment.
Timothy Pickering. He plays a role in your book. Who was he?
Timothy Pickering was the Secretary of State. I'm not sure I've ever written about someone who I have found more annoying than Timothy Pickering, if I can be honest. Timothy Pickering thought he was the smartest person in the room at all times, despite being in the room with some of the greatest minds in American history. He viewed compromise as a moral failing, and anyone who disagreed with him as a bug to be quashed. He was sort of rabid in his approach to all things. I thought it was very generous of me to cut out a line. I wanted to say that he was better suited to being on the Spanish Inquisition than in a diplomatic role, and I decided to cut that out. So I thought that was very big of me, but I'll say it now here on the podcast. He was a smart man. He was very hardworking. He could be a really good Secretary of State when he wanted to be. He engineered a trade agreement between the United States and Haiti, and it was the first time the United States had recognized a Black-led nation, so that was a huge moment, and he moved with incredible alacrity when he felt like it. He, however, had no respect for John Adams, and at times acted outwardly insubordinate, at other times worked behind the scenes to undermine Adams's nominations, his re-election campaign, his political agenda, his diplomatic agenda, and would leak documents from cabinet meetings or from the State Department to Hamilton and to others to use against Adams. And I think it's hard to find a whole lot of redeeming qualities, and at least about his tenure as Secretary of State.
I want to ask you about the two campaigns that John Adams was involved in, and got some numbers here. In 1796, when he ran, and in those days, as you tell us, the first two vote getters become president and vice president. But when I look at the numbers and I see John Adams and Thomas Jefferson next to each other, the Adams column says he got 71 electoral votes. Thomas Jefferson got 68. Adams won 9 states, Jefferson 7. I found this very interesting. The population of the country then was 35,000. I'm not sure it's the country or the number voting, 35,174 that voted for John Adams, and 30,860 who voted for Thomas Jefferson. What do those numbers tell you? And what's the background story on that?
So yes, those were the votes that were cast. The most important takeaway, I think, from this is that only about 13% of Americans were allowed to vote in those elections. So it was white men of property, and everyone else, women, people of color, indentured servants, they were all excluded. For a short period of time, women of property were allowed to vote in New Jersey, but generally as an exception, it was mostly just white men of property. And so what that meant was election tactics, electioneering looked really different because you could quite literally try and reach every single voter. And they did sometimes. In Pennsylvania in 1796, they came up with this strategy. The Republicans came up with a strategy to try and reach every single Republican voter. And there were about, I think, 12,000 votes cast in the Pennsylvania election, if I'm remembering my numbers correctly. And what they did was, under Pennsylvania law, you had to write down all the names of the electors that you are voting for, and it had to be in handwriting. It couldn't be printed. But the handwriting didn't have to match the signature. And so the Republican committees wrote out all of the names of the Republican electors and made 12,000 copies of them and distributed them around the state so that people could just put their own signature and drop it in the ballot box. That type of tactic is obviously not really possible today when you have so many more Americans that were actually casting their votes. But what that tells me is that these elections were very close. They were very contested. And even the election of 1800, which we typically think as a blowout for the Republicans and a huge Jefferson victory, without the 3/5 clause, Adams would have won that election.
Explain that.
The 3/5 clause was a part of the Constitution because representation in the House of Representatives and in the Electoral College is based on population. And a compromise was fashioned during the Constitutional Convention that 5 people of color or 5 enslaved people would count as 3 for the purposes of population counting for representation. And this was a nod to the Southern states who were worried that their representation would really be diluted in Congress. It was a compromise that people were very unhappy with at the time, but they felt was required to get the Southern states to sign the Constitution. Whether or not they were right, it's hard to say, but that's what they believed at the time. And so that 3/5 clause gave Southern states way more representation in Congress and way more representation in the Electoral College all the way up through the Civil War, and affected the outcome of the election as early as 1800.
Why do you think Thomas Jefferson and the Committee of 5 that wrote the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, they didn't write the Constitution, but also what they decided in the Constitution, why do you think all this flowery language about equality was written, and in the end, as you point out, only white men of property could vote? What were they thinking? Have you figured that one out?
I think that question has spawned an awful lot of books. So my answer to that is It's really hard to build something from scratch, especially a nation. Most nations are founded on a shared territory, a shared ethnic background, a shared religion. They're very rarely based on a hodgepodge of people that don't really have a whole lot of emotional connections to one another, that don't share a religion, that don't share an ethnic background. When the delegates were getting together for the first time at the the Continental Congress in Philadelphia in 1774, more delegates had been to London than had been to Philadelphia, which I share that fact as a demonstration that they saw their main point of reference as the homeland as opposed to one another. So they had to articulate the ideas behind what it was they were trying to do. And it didn't mean they were going to create a perfect thing, but they had to put forth the goal for what they would try and achieve. And I really think of the Constitution as part 2 of the Declaration of Independence. You have the, all men are created equal, and then you have the Constitution saying we're going to try and create a more perfect union. Not a perfect one, a more perfect one. And yet they were very moderate in their reform. I think one of the reasons that the American Revolution was successful is because it wasn't super radical. It was not like the French Revolution that was creating a whole new way of organizing society. Many of the men that were in positions of authority before remained in positions of authority. There was a very similar code of laws that was basically copied and pasted into the colonies. The systems and the culture behind participation in voting looked fairly similar. And yet that concept of to create a more perfect union is a powerful one. And so there have been attempts over the decades and the centuries to be more expansive of who gets to be included in that process. And I think their legacy of trying to constantly create something that was more perfect, recognizing that what they had done was flawed, but that hopefully future generations would do a better job, is the legacy that we should hold on to, and is much more useful than thinking of them as these like perfect demigods.
Your book has been published in September of 2024. When did you finish it?
Well, my final draft I submitted to Oxford University Press in December of 2023. And then we did, several rounds. You have the copy edits and the page proofs and all of those things, which take a long time and are essential to try and get the book into as good a shape as possible. But I would say that I was really, really locked in the spring of 2024. And then it went to the publisher.
Why did Oxford Press want to publish a book on John Adams?
It's an excellent question. We should ask them. I think that they understood hopefully what is the modern relevance to our contemporary moment, that the creation of these norms and precedents that Adams was so instrumental in shaping continue to serve as the scaffolding for our institutions. Most of our political institutions rely on a whole lot of participation and goodwill. They're often not written down in a whole lot of detail. And so those norms and customs serve as the thing that continues to govern our system. And that has a lot of relevance for our current moment, both in understanding how we got here, but also as we go into an election season when we might potentially have another messy election like they had, and we will have another transition one way or the other. What that will look like will hopefully adhere to the best principles laid forth by John Adams.
From your perspective, what have we learned as a result of the 2020 election?
I think that we learned that this is a whole lot more fragile than we thought it was, that it really does depend on the people who are participating in these practices. It depends on both sides being committed to those transitions, but it is much easier to tear it down and to destroy those norms and precedents than we thought it was going to be.
What's your view of the justice system, which Donald Trump has managed to, I don't know what word you want to use, he's come out of it so far without, he's pushed these federal cases right off the attention at the moment. What's your reaction to that?
Well, our justice system by design does move slow, but it should move. And I think for me, my big concern is not so much what any particular outcome would be. because I'm not on the jury, although I think it's important for all Americans to assess what they see with their own eyes. But my concern is that we are at a point where the American people have a astonishing low level of trust in our American institutions. And that's true for the media, that is true for Congress, that's true for the presidency, but that is increasingly true for the judicial system. And that's really, really dangerous, because in a republic, these institutions have to have trust of citizens or they don't work. And so the longer we go without there appearing to be any sort of decision in these cases, I think it will lead to an erosion of trust for the American people that the judicial system can actually hold people accountable or can at least operate with the appropriate due process. And so I'm hopeful that they will continue to work to demonstrate that no one person is above the law. No former president is above the law. And if he is judged innocent by a jury of his peers, then that is due process. But there should be a jury and there should be a decision.
We talked about the 96 election, which Adams got 71 electoral votes, Thomas Jefferson 68. Then we moved to 1800, where Adams dropped from 71 to 65. And Jefferson went from 68 to 73. Also, Adams lost votes from 35,000 down to 29,000, and Jefferson went from 30,000 up to 45,000. The question I have for you, how messy was that election, and what was changed because of it?
Oh, the election itself was just a disaster. Not only was not only was the election leading up to it incredibly contentious, and the attempts to disparage both sides were really quite awful. And, we think that our elections are bad, and they certainly were not at a high point in terms of collegiality. But once it became clear that Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr were going to tie, and that the election was going to go to the House of Representatives, and each state would have a vote, there were 2 months between the time it was clear that there was a tie and between the time that Congress actually opened the results and certified them. And in those 2 months, the Federalists thought about all sorts of ways that they could potentially postpone a result, appoint a new president, maybe call a new election. Those threats caused the Republicans to form militias on the border of Virginia and Pennsylvania to threaten to march into D.C. A mob gathered outside of the Capitol and threatened to kill any president that took over that was not Jefferson or Burr. And then once they actually started the voting, it took 36 ballots to finally come to a decision and to break the stalemate. So it was about as contentious and about as bad as you can get.
But in your opinion, why did Adams lose, and why did he get, for instance, why did he go from 35,000 votes down to 29,000? What was going on?
I think there are a couple of explanations for his poor performance. The first was that the thing that he was most proud of, the Treaty of Morne-Fontaine, which he signed with France, or which the envoy signed with France, that established peace. And that peace has been lasting since 1800. News of that had not yet returned to the United States before most people cast their votes. So there was a question about whether or not his judgment on diplomacy would bear out. And it did. It just maybe bore out a little bit too late. The second thing is the division in the Federalist Party certainly undermined his support, because I think it probably drove down what we would consider to be turnout. There were a lot of Federalists who just were not very enthusiastic about voting for him because they were more allied with James McHenry and Timothy Pickering and Alexander Hamilton. But I think perhaps the most important factor were the American people were distrusting of what they thought of as the Federalist system. And that includes the Alien and Sedition Acts, the taxes that were raised to pay for the expanded army, and the army itself. It's a mistake to think that just the Alien and Sedition Acts caused Adams to lose. I don't think that that's so. I think it is the combination of all of those things seemed like a Federalist plot to suppress the American people and to suppress their opponents and to change the way that the American Republic existed. And that was unpopular for a lot of people. And Adams knew it was unpopular, and he pushed back against it in some pretty significant ways. But it did cause a lot of people to vote against the Federalists.
With your mention of the Alien and Sedition Act, I want you to tell the story of William Duane.
Well, William Duane was an Irishman. He had immigrated to the United States. He was the editor of the Aurora paper, which had been established by Benjamin Franklin Bache, who was the grandson of Benjamin Franklin. The paper had a reputation of being the thorn in the side of any sort of Federalist administration. And so William Duane picked up that mantle after Bache died from yellow fever and really just tormented the Federalists. He printed article after article condemning them and pointing out their flaws and pointing out their failings. There were several attempts to hold him to account, both for the criticism but also for leaking deliberations and leaking materials that Republicans in Congress had given to him. He was brought forth on charges under the Sedition Act several times. And every time he was able to basically outwit the local attorney, because he said that the people he was going to bring as evidence, basically, of truth were government officials, which would have been very embarrassing for the administration, or they were out of town, and so they were able to postpone the trial. So at several moments, he was able to basically outrun or outflank the U.S. attorney, and ultimately the cases against him were dismissed once Thomas Jefferson became president and was able to dismiss the charges.
How much difference, in your opinion, is there between the media of those times and the media today?
Well, I think that there's probably more similarity than people would think. There were papers that really did try and keep things down the center. David Claypool was an editor of one newspaper that had most of the contracts for the government, so he printed things like bills and the Constitution. That was the paper that Washington had selected for his farewell address. Then there were papers that were very clearly pro-Republican papers, and there were papers that were very clearly Federalist papers. I think there are two key differences. Well, in addition to the fact that we have social media and all of that, but there are two key, I think, structural differences. The first is that Americans in the 1790s understood how this system worked. They understood when they were reading a partisan paper. And so they had what we would consider to be a higher media literacy than a lot of the people we do today. And that is because the second key difference is there was not this concept of like a journalistic ethos of trying to find the truth and share the truth, to hold people in power to account with the truth. That was something that really developed in the late 1800s, what's called muckraking journalism. And so there were not really figures like Walter Cronkite, who mostly everyone trusted to give them the accurate story. And so because people in the 1790s didn't have that, they understood that they were reading partisan stuff that was going to often just lie. Today, there are a lot of people who are still operating thinking that the system we are living in is one like the 1960s, where there were 3 TV channels and newsmen typically held themselves to certain standards, and so you could trust what they say. There are still people like that, but not all people operating in the media space are operating under that same sort of ethos. And it's just that Americans haven't yet caught up to be able to decipher what is trustworthy and what is rabidly partisan.
As we close out, what's your favorite Adams story to tell others?
My favorite Adams story to tell others. So one of my favorite moments about John Adams, because I think it shows all the parts about him I like. Shortly after his inauguration, Abigail was at home in Quincy, Massachusetts, taking care of John's mother, who was sick and dying. And he desperately wanted her to come to Philadelphia because he needed her help with the president's house. He was so overwhelmed with the duties of office. And he wrote letter after letter pleading with him to come, pleading for her to come, pleading for her to come be with him and to help him. And at one point he said, like she had written back and said, I'm taking care of the house. I'm taking care of your mother. These are things that are on my mind. I can't just leave. And he writes back and he says, well, but what about me? What about what I need? What about the president? What are you going to do about that? And then he writes at the end, don't laugh, because he knows that he's being ridiculous and petulant and whining about things when she has so much on her plate. I love that he both needed her and wanted her so much, but also had the good sense to know when he was being absurd. And when she did finally come down, he could not, despite having been married for 30 years at this point, he could not wait another moment, and he met her outside town so that they could have a picnic before coming back into town.
Our listeners can't see the cover of this book, but What is it that I'm looking at when I see John Adams? Who did that painting?
So I believe this is a Gilbert Stuart portrait. I was very intentional in selecting this portrait because I think that it shows a little bit more of the jovial John Adams that I am trying to bring forward. And it's in the Massachusetts Historical Society collection. It's not very well known, so hopefully it will look a little different to people than some of the other John Adams portraits that they know. And it is, I think he makes him look very lifelike, which is one of the reasons I like it.
Single best source for you to write this book?
Well, obviously the Adams papers, I would say, would be the obvious choice, especially the Adams family papers, which were the papers between Abigail and John and their children and their family members and some of their friends. The one that is perhaps more unexpected are the Theodore Sedgwick papers. Those are also at the Massachusetts Historical Society. They are not digitized, so not too many people have used them. Sedgwick had beautiful handwriting, so they are a joy to read, which is not always a guarantee. But because Sedgwick was such an important ally to Adams early on in the presidency and then turned and really became one of his key enemies, the letters are full of information about Adams' savviness and then the division between the party and are incredibly useful.
Who was Theodore Sedgwick?
Theodore Sedgwick was a senator from Massachusetts, and then at the end of Adams' presidency, he became the Speaker of the House. He was born in Essex County. His house actually still exists in Massachusetts. It's out west. It's in private hands, so at some point I might have to accidentally get lost and knock on the door and then ask to see their house. But he had been friends with Adams for decades. They had known each other for a very long time, and it was one of the cruelties that Adams really felt sad that he lost that relationship. And to make matters worse, on March 4th, 1801, when Adams climbed into the public coach to leave Washington, D.C. at 4:30 in the morning to go back to Massachusetts, sitting across from him was Theodore Sedgwick. So that must have been a very uncomfortable coach ride. I
just put John Adams into Google and just to see what comes up. And this will be my last question to you. There's one note that said Benjamin Franklin and Adams grew to both hate each other. Why? Is that true?
Well, I'm not sure I would use the word hate. I think that they both found the other incredibly befuddling at times. Benjamin Franklin has this amazing quote that says, John Adams is often a wise man. Am I going to get this right? Let's see. He is, I think he's often a wise man. He is always I'm going to totally butcher it. But anyway, the punchline is that he is always he's always a loyal patriot. He is often a wise man, but sometimes he's absolutely out of his senses. And I think that really gets at the different approaches that they brought to diplomacy in particular. And when they were together in France, their personalities could not have been more different. And Adams just could not stand the way that French conducted diplomacy because it felt so slippery. It felt so nebulous. It felt like they were never actually doing work. Whereas when he was in the Netherlands or when he was in London, there was much more of a cultural overlap and he could get things done and talk to people in a productive manner. And so Franklin felt like Adams was really risking his diplomatic work that he had done. And Adams felt like Franklin was way too friendly to the French and was letting them get away with murder. And so they just really found each other very frustrating. I'm not sure I would say hate.
By the way, if you want to hear more from Lindsay Chervinsky, episode 131, as I said earlier, is in this series where she talks about a previous book on the cabinet. And this book is called Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents That Forged the Republic. Thank you, Lindsay Chervinsky.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Booknotes Plus podcast. Please rate and review Booknotes Plus, and don't forget to follow so you never miss an episode. Questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.